Hvala i dobar den na site. But I'm afraid the rest is going to be in English.
Well,
I've
good.
been to Macedonia many times. A few years ago, before I gave some public talks in Skopje, um, is he the government minister or a senior official concerning religious affairs, Sotirovsky, it was talking to me and I said, "Yeah, so have you been to Macedonia often?" And I told him how many times. He said, "Oh, you're half Macedonian." I
Oh,
wanted to say,
welcome.
I wanted to say yes, and the other half is Croat.
But you don't say that to the Macedonian, of course.
No.
Only Macedonian.
Only Macedonians. Yeah. So, I am a church historian. I taught in a seminary in London, leading a theology degree program there for about 10 years before moving to the States. But my other speciality is actually just the general history, secular history, if you like, particularly of Central and Eastern Europe, and especially the Balkans, because I've been involved in this part of the world for 30 years. So when I came to retire, it was an easy decision to make as to where to come and live. And so now I'm here full time rather than just constantly visiting. But just to explain a little bit about why I want to deal with the topic we're talking about today. While I was still in Britain, obviously I was teaching in the seminary, but I was, as you would expect, involved in a local church as well. And one time, the pastor asked me to lead a meeting of two home groups gathering together in the same place. They were doing it a special way. I can't remember what the reason was, but and he told us the kind of thing that he wanted us to discuss. Well, I tried an exercise with the people who were there. I broke them down into groups of two or maybe three. I tried an exercise with there. Oh, there's feedback there. Right.
Hello?
Sorry, I think there was a technical glitch there. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I gave each group a piece of paper and a pencil and gave them 5 to 10 minutes to talk among themselves and write down the core of what the gospel was as they would explain it in jargon-free language to someone who wasn't a Christian. And oh, the weeping and wailing that went up from the room. And when we regathered a few minutes later and saw what they had written, I understood why. Now, this was a good church, orthodox and sound, Bible preaching, and people still didn't have the core of what we're saying, the core of the Christian message, clearly in their minds, so that they could then present that to someone who wasn't a Christian. Now, this lesson to me was powerfully reinforced after I moved to the States. I was teaching not in a theological college, but just a Christian liberal arts college, like a university for people who are Christians from a variety of denominations, mostly evangelical of one kind or another. Of course, not all of the students were Christians. Some were there because their parents wanted them to be there and so on. But most of them had been brought up in good and godly Christian homes. And one of the things that I found there that reinforced the lesson that I just mentioned back from England was that these kids who'd been to church every week of their lives didn't know one end of the Bible from the other, and they didn't know the core of Christian teaching. Right? What they were getting was, now I'm being a bit rude here, they were not getting an orthodoxy, they were getting an orthopathy. Right? And because of this, since I really learned this lesson, every time I preach, nearly every time I preach, I don't try to do something special or look for something prophetic or something encouraging or whatever it is. I will take one of the central Christian doctrines and explain that. Because however tragic it is, however embarrassing it is, most Christians do not really know. Right. So, and that, of course, brings us to why we're doing what we're doing today. There's another reason for picking on this topic, and I will explain it as we're going along. So it's the idea it's there in Judaism, but it's even more important to Christians that people are created in the image of God. And I want to jump off with just a couple of important Bible texts here. Clara, is this being shown to people on the PowerPoint? I'll
Not
kind of.
yet. We are going to show it now.
Oh, okay.
So we go now on the PowerPoint.
On the
right?
PowerPoint, yes, and I'll say when we need to move on each
Yes.
slide. So
Just a minute, please. We go on the
Okay.
PowerPoint, everybody.
okay, so here we go. Okay, while that's happening, I'm going to give a little advert here. If you like this content by some miracle, please check out on YouTube my podcast channel, which is called A Foggy Day on Olympus. A Foggy Day on Olympus, which is a kind of a little joke, that deals with not exclusively Christian subjects, but mostly, or let us say, Christian adjacent subjects, because we want to get some non-Christians tuning in as well. So we speak to our audience as though they weren't Christians, with the idea of kind of getting them to latch on to the sort of things that we want to say. So A Foggy Day on Olympus, if you like this kind of thing. Okay, so here we've got our what can we call it? Title page. Let's just consider on the next slide now, Psalm 8. Okay, if we can move to that and we'll read that together. Okay. O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth, who've set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babes and nursing infants, you've ordained strength because of your enemies, that you may silence the enemy and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you've ordained, what is man that you're mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? For you have made him a little lower than the angels. We'll come back to that phrase later. And you have crowned him with glory and honor. You've made him to have dominion over the works of your hands. You've put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, even the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea that pass through the paths of the seas. O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth. So the psalmist is looking at the creation that God has made and being absolutely astounded at the creation and even more at its creator. And then saying, well, given that these things are so, what on earth is humanity? And yet you've put all of this creation under the feet of mankind. Okay, we'll move on a slide here. And then I think quickly another one for one of my silly little jokes. Okay, the serious bit first. This is a picture of one of my favorite people in the whole of Christian history, D.L. Moody, 19th century American evangelist. He had a kind of stature back in the 1880s, 1890s, similar to what Billy Graham had in the second half of the 20th century. And it was said of him once when he came to preach to a rather sophisticated crowd that they came to mock and stayed to pray. This contrasts very sharply with yours truly. Next slide. Mike Pierce, apostle to the dyspeptics. They came to pray and stayed to mock. My sermons don't always end as well as Moody's did, but okay. Let's put that on one side here. Let's get serious again and look at another key passage from Scripture in the next slide. So this is Genesis chapter 1, and just a couple of verses here. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle." This is what the psalmist was saying, isn't it? Right? Over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Right? Until a very few years ago, the last bit there just seemed like a standard bit of Hebrew poetry. You know how Hebrew poetry works. Everything is said twice, and the second half kind of reflects the first half using slightly different words. But now we look at that and we realize that this has become a controversial statement. Oh my goodness, the territory that we are in. Now, I think certainly if you're if you've been a Christian a long time, maybe even if you're not a Christian, but you're just familiar with some of these Christian ideas, you'll be familiar with the idea that people are created in the image of God. And most of us don't really think about what that means. The phrase gets waved around like a sort of flag, rather than thinking about what is meant by this expression. So I want us to think through now what we really mean by that. So let's move on to our next slide and consider several possibilities that are sometimes mentioned. When people do say, well, what does it mean? Sometimes people will say, well, it's because human beings are much more intelligent than dogs and cats and so on. And this is true, although I would want to raise two quibbles about this. What about dolphins? They're supposed to be easily as intelligent as people from measurements that scientists have made. And what about, we leave aside here me being so rude to the intelligence of my students. I was always questioning their intelligence just to tease them, you understand. But being serious, looking at tragic situations, what about people who are seriously mentally handicapped? Right? Are they created in the image of God? Well, we want to say that they are. There are a number of very, very secular people today. One thinks of people like so-called moral philosopher Peter Singer, who would be in favor of, euthanizing people that didn't come up to a certain standard. And it's the Christians who are saying, no, you can't do that. Never mind the fact that this person is woefully deficient mentally. They're a human being and created in the image of God and therefore precious. So when people point to intelligence, I want to say, yes, but that's not definitive. That's not decisive. Other times, Christians will point to the idea that human beings have a moral sense. All right. So we have a sense of morality. And of course, we very, very, very frequently don't follow that. That's what we mean when we say that people are sinful. But that's a talk for another occasion. It's a very, very important topic, but it's not today's. Right? But even though people are sinful, we certainly do have a moral sense. All right. So if we let's think of an awful situation here. Supposing a ferocious dog attacks someone and causes terrible injury, right? What we tend to do, what the public authorities in most countries will do, is they will put down the dog. They'll give it an injection that put it to sleep that will kill it, right? But we're not morally blaming the dog. It was a dog, right? That's what dogs do under certain circumstances. But we're saying that people do have a moral sense, right? It's stronger in some people and weaker in others. A lot of it depending on things like their upbringing and stuff like that. And that's another topic that Scripture talks about, bringing up children in the way they should go, so that when they're older they won't depart from it. And then when we've got terrible households, that tends not to happen, or even bad ideas are instilled. But nevertheless, it is there. So, yes, that's something important as well. Although it raises the rather mischievous question, and I love asking mischievous questions: are psychopaths fully human? Well, I think finally they are too. What about spiritual awareness? Now, this answer sounds so spiritual. We're all afraid to quibble with it, but I'm afraid of the main suggestions that people make. This is the one that I'm least happy with, even though I think it's true. I think it's true that human beings are unique amongst the animals and creatures in having a spiritual awareness and an ability to be aware of God, and because of Christ, the coming of Christ, we can commune with God, right? But it's a bit of a circular argument. We say that people are created in the image of God because people can commune with God. That's a very tight little circle of logic. Right? Now, I don't really quibble with it on those grounds. Almost all religious, theological, and philosophical ideas are generally circular, right? But I have a weak stomach, let us say. I like my circles to be nice and big. If they get really tight like this, I feel a little queasy. I like big circles that account for more and more of the data of the universe, the world, as we see it, before I am prepared to be persuaded. So I want to say about this, it's true, but I would never want to make that argument to a non-Christian, because you won't get anywhere, right? It's too tiny a little circle. What about a free will? I think this is one of the most important. Let me just be clear here. I'm not dismissing any of these. I think they're all part of it, but there's no one that has the key, right? They're all part of the picture. But maybe a free will is the most important one. Let's suppose now, let's imagine that the atheists are right. Okay, there's no God. All that exists is matter, and we are essentially animals, and we are the way that we are because of our chemical and genetic inheritance, our biological makeup, the direction that our hormones are pointing this morning, the state of our digestion, and that's it. That accounts for everything that you are and how you're going to act, right? In that scenario, rigidly consistent materialist atheists will say free will is a delusion. You don't have a free will. Everything is determined. Basically, you're an extremely complicated sort of rock, right? In which what happens in every given moment is the inevitable product of the previous moment, which is itself the inevitable product of the moment before it, right? Everything is simply physical, biological, chemical, energy forces playing themselves out. Right? Well, as Christians, we don't think any of that, right? We concede that that is going to be true of the rocks, and in a more complicated sort of way, it's going to be true of animals. It's not true of human beings, right? We do have volition. That's why, in the example I gave a few moments ago with the dog that savages someone and injures them, we don't morally blame the dog because it didn't have that kind of a choice, right? Whereas we do blame you if you do something bad because you could have done otherwise than you did. And if you do something wonderful, we praise you because, again, you had a choice. You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to sacrifice yourself, right? That's what we mean. And basically, even people who are not Christians accept this way of reasoning. Now, I don't want to push this too far, even though personally I think this is very, very important, because the atheist would push back on me and say, well, you think that you have free choice, but what about how far you're conditioned by your environment and your upbringing? You're the kind of person you are because of the way that you were brought up. To look no further than language, you can't speak Korean. You could have if you dedicated years and years to learning it. You speak naturally the language you were brought up in, right? And in the other languages you've acquired along the way by painful study, but you still think in the one you were brought up in, right? If there's some dreadful crime that happens, whilst someone who has been well brought up and well socialized might have done it, statistically, that's not the way to bet. And the police have an idea of the kind of person they're looking for from pretty early on. Now, I admit all of this, right, as Christians have to do, right? These things are certainly true. They play a role, but that's not all that we are, right? There are people from wonderful backgrounds who've descended into dreadful deeds in their lives because they had a choice. There are people from terrible backgrounds. I was reading the other day about, I don't really follow these things with sporting and pop music characters and what have you, but the basketball player LeBron James comes from a dreadful background and has, from what I was reading, turned out to be an absolutely wonderful human being in his family life and his personal life, and giving away, I think he's funded, what was it, 2,300 children from deprived backgrounds like his own to pay for their education. All of this, right? Because he had a choice. Right? So, and in this, we are like God, right? The material universe is simply matter playing itself out, unless and until God intervenes directly, and we call that event a miracle, right? But absent that, it's just these forces playing themselves out, and you know that every day as you make your way around even your house, right? If you boiled the kettle to make a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or something, you knew that things were going to happen in a regular pattern, right? God is, well, in the Christian understanding, is both transcendent, outside of the creation he's made, and immanent. Not imminent, meaning happening in a moment, but immanent, saturating it at every place. By the way, Christians are often very bad. They emphasize the first and they keep forgetting the second. Both are important, right? Now, so God can act without being simply acted upon, in a way that is not true of my glasses case, right? That can't act. It can only be acted upon by me or someone else picking it up, what have you. But God can act without being acted upon. Now, this is not entirely true of us, right? We are within the created order. and yet we do have a choice. So we are like, I'm trying to think of a metaphor here. We're like people who have maybe a foot, maybe not even a whole foot, maybe just a few toes outside, right? That we can, to a limited extent and within the parameters of our physical being, how big, strong we are, the way that we've been brought up, and so on, we can nevertheless, within those parameters, act without simply being acted upon. And that is why when you do something bad, we blame you. When you do something wonderful, we tell you how fantastic you are. And we are not wrong. Okay? Because, and in that, we are corresponding to the image of God in us. Because God can also act without simply being acted upon. Okay, now, about 20 years ago, no, more than that. This is the trouble with being so old and having lived now for hundreds of years. I forget when things happened. A long time ago, 25 years ago at least, I came across this passage from one of the late 4th century church fathers. So we're going to move on to the next slide here. This is Gregory of Nyssa. Can we move on? No, previous one. You went on 2 there. That's it. Thank you. Gregory of Nyssa. So he lives from around 335 to around 395. And we have a load of his writings, but one of them is called On the Making of Man. And he's discussing just the kind of subject that we're looking at today. And we're going to look at this passage from it. And he says something that's a little tricky, so we're going to take this slowly. He starts off by quoting Romans 11. Who has known the mind of the Lord? The apostle asks. And I ask further, who's understood his own mind? Let those tell us who consider the nature of God to be within their comprehension. Right? People who are proud and think they understand everything about how God is. And he's wanting to say, you can't know that. Whether they understand themselves, if they know the nature of their own mind. Okay, move on. That's it. But I find the solution of these difficulties by recourse to the very utterance of God. For he says, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And therefore, here's the complicated bit. Let's take it really slow. Therefore, since one of the attributes we contemplate in the divine nature is incomprehensibility of essence. Right, let's slow down here and just go back. What he's saying is, when we consider God, you don't understand his essence. You can't, right? It's above us and beyond us. Incomprehensibility of essence. That's one of the characteristics of God. It's clearly necessary that in this point, the image, humanity, should be able to show its imitation of the archetype. What he's saying is, you don't understand the nature of God, and you don't understand your own mind. And that is a reflection of the fact that you can't understand God either. Since the nature of our mind, which is the likeness of the Creator, evades our knowledge, it accurately resembles the superior nature, figuring by its own unknowableness, the incomprehensible nature. Now, if you think about that, that's practically hilarious. You know, I could imagine Woody Allen making that point, only in much simpler language, in one of his movies. Okay, so you don't get yourself, you don't get God. That's the way it's supposed to be, right? I think that's brilliant. Okay, so what are we saying then? That in the image of God in us, yes, it's kind of related to intelligence, but you wouldn't want to hang the whole coat on that hook. Moral sense, yeah, a bit more. Spiritual nature, yes, but you certainly can't prove it. The little circle of argument is too tight. Free will, yeah, that's a better one. But all of them really. And then we come to Gregory of Nyssa's point, right? That the thing kind of eludes us, evades us. Okay, now I want to move on just briefly to something that C.S. Lewis says about the composite nature of human beings. So let's move on a slide here. It's just one sentence. Right. So he's saying that humanity is a kind of a hybrid. By his intellect, man is mere spirit. And by his appetite, mere animal. Now that he's taking this from his book, The Abolition of Man. By the way, I have to own up here. C.S. Lewis is my very favorite writer ever. And my favorite of all his books is this one, The Abolition of Man. If you're not familiar with it, I would urge you to read it. It's a little difficult. It's only 60 pages, though, so it's not long. It's 3 short lectures that he gave in 1943. And it completely blew my mind when I read it at the age of about 24, 25. And all these years later, I would point to it without a moment's hesitation as the best book I've ever read. In fact, when it came out, when Metanoia Press, run by Nada Milkov, did a translation of this book into Macedonian, Nada asked me to write a foreword for it because he knew how crazy I am about this book. Okay, so what he's saying here is that we are a kind of a hybrid. We're a little lower than the angels. We're kind of halfway between heaven and earth. We're on earth, just like the dogs and the cats and the cattle and the and what have you, right? And the plants and the rocks. And in our material aspect, we are, yes, we're animals, right? By our appetites, the things that we want, we are mere animals. But by our intellect, we're mere spirit. So we are a kind of a hybrid. And that, it seems to me, sums up the situation beautifully. But of course, this creates problems, as we all encounter every day. No matter what kind of person we are, we all encounter this stuff. We experience ourselves as absurd because of it. So let's go on to the next slide. Our spirit and our mind give us pretensions to which other animals, let us say, cannot aspire, right? Your cat really doesn't care how it looks in front of all the other cats or in front of you. It just is, right? It doesn't. Not only does it not have clothes, it doesn't even really care how its fur looks, right? It's not putting on a front. Right? It just does whatever it feels and wants at that moment. It doesn't have social aspirations. But our spirit and our mind give us pretensions of that kind. And they can't be entirely fulfilled, of course. Right? You might have aspirations to be the most glamorous person in your acquaintance, or appear as one of the most prosperous, or perhaps one of the cleverest and most expert in your field or other fields. And of course, you will fail time and time and time again. Right? And our animal nature and our physical frailty make demands upon us that mock our hopes of or claims to importance or permanence, right? So no matter how good a piano player you are, you're going to hit a duff note. And even if you never do that somehow by sheer brilliance and constancy of practice, that may not rescue you from getting performance fright or showing up somewhere to play and suddenly having a terrible tummy upset and having to run out of the room. The point that I'm making is that our animal nature mocks our claims to importance and, of course, to permanence. As we get older, we will look, well, even if we did look that good when we were younger, we will look worse and worse as we get older, as you look at me right at this moment. And those, our animal nature, our frailty, threaten to make us repellent or ridiculous to ourselves and our fellows. Right? So, even the strongest of us can slip on a banana skin and fall over and look like an idiot. Right? No longer so impressive. Even the most beautiful of us can be blighted by a sudden outbreak of spots or something. Right. This is the point I'm making here. And so our proper response to this absurdity, and let's move on to the next slide here, is laughter. Almost all humor arises from the chasm between the way things are and the way they ought to be, and the sense of incongruity that this chasm produces. That's basically, you listen to comedians, that's what nearly always it's about. And submitting to the laughter, especially at oneself, it's not the same thing as humility, but it is a precondition for it. Right? This is why when you meet someone who has no sense of humor, you tend quite rightly to be wary of them, because it means that they are not remotely self-critical, probably have no real profound sense of sin, likely to be self-righteous. Okay. And the problem is compounded, of course, by sin and suffering. This world is simultaneously, it's not just we in our own selves, but the world that we're in, it's simultaneously good in the sense of being made by God, and tragic because fallen. And again, we all live with the duality of the dichotomy of that every day. We're all aware of it, right? You relax into the beautiful, expensive armchair that you just bought, and you think, "Oh, I'm so glad I could have this. This is really nice, and I've decorated this room to look really great." And then you remember that one of your relatives has a really serious sickness, and you just want to roll up in that armchair and put your hands over your heads. Think, "Oh, what?" Right? We all experience this every day. So, next slide. So being trapped between the worlds, that's one of C.S. Lewis's phrase, is essentially the same thing as a little lower than the angels, is a key part of our relatedness to God. And here we come to the tragedy of modern people, because they've tried to sever that link, to cut it, under the delusion that that makes them more free. And of course, it does nothing of the sort. All it does is make us more and more slaves to our sinful nature. And we make ourselves meaningless creatures. And it seems to me that, and here we come to the reason why I'm talking about this subject today, because I've talked about it in many places over the last couple of years, that this needs to be part of an evangelistic cutting edge, right? We are now mostly, certainly in Western countries, living in amidst populations who have no real sense of sin, right? They're prepared to rail against evil, generally, by which they usually mean whatever politics they happen to disagree with and hate, right? But they don't meaningfully have a sense of sin. But they're messed up and despairing. Families are disintegrating. Far more young people are abused than ever was the case a few generations ago, because of wildly dysfunctional families. By the way, another little advert here for my podcast. A Foggy Day on Olympus. We're just about to air tomorrow the fourth and last in a series on exactly this subject, sexual chaos and identity crisis. But it's on YouTube, so you can go and look at back numbers and stuff like that. So we say a lot more about that there. So people feel that their lives are meaningless because they think of themselves as just animals. They're free to do whatever they want, except that, of course, they're just as trapped by circumstances as anybody else in the world and anybody else in human history. And their circumstances are actually worse. Again, because of private unhappiness, dysfunctional homes, and all the rest of it. They have a whole load of choices, including now, apparently, you can choose your gender. But the choices just seem so meaningless. It's no wonder that people are disfiguring themselves with, what I rather, very bad of me, what I call facial ironmongery and rather a lot of ink, right? Because those are signs actually of self-hatred. And this is where Christians can come in and say, look, we know you feel this way. We understand why you feel this way. You are not wrong to feel this way, but we have some good news. You're valuable, uniquely valuable, because you're created in the image of God. Right. So
Wow.
Out of all the key Christian doctrines, this is the one that I most frequently want to talk about. Though, believe me, given if anybody is foolish enough to give me the chance, I will talk about the other ones as well. And there's a whole list of about 10 or 12 of these. But they're all, in my view, under-addressed in our churches in favor of, so how is your heart this morning? Right. And like I say, I have bad experience of spending nearly 2 decades in a Christian college teaching kids from Christian homes who've been brought up with 52 weeks a year of, so how is your heart this morning? Right. We need this stuff, but it's quite clear in our minds. Right. So we've got a solid grasp on what the Christian faith is. And once we've got that, we're in a position to look for ways to present that to people around us who don't know these things and to give them hope. Okay, next slide. So if the atheists are right, if we are merely the products of matter plus time plus chance, we are not free from God, and so in charge of our own destiny, as the secularists have been saying for the last 200 years. We're the product of impersonal forces, physical, chemical, genetic, and social. And what that means is that we're not simply on a level with the animals, but with the rocks, because the animate is held, in this way of looking at things, to derive via long, complicated processes over millions of years from the inanimate, right? So it's not that we're simply on a level with the monkeys, we're on a level with the rocks. And of course, what Genesis is telling us is that that's not true. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole debate here about, how to read Genesis and, literal six-day creationism and all this, because I think that is actually an irrelevant discussion, and Christians have derailed themselves and often shot their own credibility in the foot by majoring on minors. Pre-modern people knew how to read pre-modern texts. Moderns, including Christians, mostly don't. Right? What Genesis is giving us is not some blow-by-blow history account. It's giving us information about who God is, what he is like, who people are, what they are like, what the problem is, what the creation that God has created is like. Right? And pre-modern people understood this instinctively in a way that moderns, including Christians, have forgotten. And so we end up having loads of pointless debate. So we're focusing on the meaning of what we're being told here in Genesis. Okay. I want to move on now to another key aspect of this that affects many aspects of lives today. Does the imago Dei, the image of God in people, make human lives sacrosanct? Now, standardly, Christians have said that it does. Oh, we're getting some feedback here, Clara. I'm not sure. Is it? Oh, I think that's okay. Yeah.
Brothers and sisters, I'm asking you to put your mute off. Okay, like Sister Jane, and everybody put your microphone off, the sound off, please. Otherwise, we have echo. Thank you.
See.
Hij moet wel kijken
Yeah,
natuurlijk.
I know.
I should be right. Okay, right.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank
okay.
you.
Okay, so does the image of God in people make human lives sacrosanct? Christians have very consistently said that it does. So next slide. Oh, and next one. Right. So the image of God doctrine of humanity is why, for example, Christians have standardly opposed abortion, right? Because they say that even the baby in the womb is a human being created in the image of God and therefore valuable. Now, that great American Southern Baptist Bill Clinton used to like to smirkingly ask Christian leaders when they tackled him on this subject, I'm going to do about abortion just what the New Testament says. And of course, his little joke was that the New Testament doesn't mention it. Okay, very good, clever. But Scripture, particularly in the Old Testament, does talk about this. And certainly the church fathers did so. Let's have a look at some of these key quotations now. So next slide, please. This is from the Epistle of Barnabas. We're not quite clear when it was written. It may have been early 2nd century, but we think late 1st century. You shall not kill either the fetus by abortion or the newborn, which back in the Roman Empire, people did, right? Because if they were inconvenient for whatever reason. Tertullian, writing around 197, so say 100 years after the Epistle of Barnabas, but we are not permitted, since murder has been prohibited to us once and for all, even to destroy the fetus in the womb. It makes no difference whether one destroys a life that has already been born or one that's in the process of birth. He is a man who is to be a man. And further, next slide, please. Here's Minucius Felix. His book, Octavius, is a wonderful evangelistic book. And sadly, we aren't quite sure when Minucius Felix lived. We don't have a load of details about him like we do concerning Tertullian. So it might have been 2nd century, it might have been 3rd. But he says, some take medicines to destroy the germ of future life in their own bodies, so abortifacient drugs. They commit infanticide before they've given birth to the infant. And he's talking about that in a way which shows quite clearly Christians disapproved. Rather later, Ambrose of Milan, Bishop of Milan, which was the Roman capital for a while in the late 4th century, the rich kill the fruit of their own bodies in the womb, lest their property be divided up. And they destroy their own children in the womb with murderous potions, and before life has been passed on, it's annihilated. Okay, so it's pretty clear that Christians took a stance against this from the beginning. Another key topic, so let's move on to the next slide. The image of God doctrine of humanity is why Christians have standardly been cautious about when and how, or even if, to wage war. Now, we're not going to dive into the huge topic and debate about whether Christians should be pacifists or what kind of view they should take. Those who want to get into this, and here comes another little advert, next slide please, could look up online my book, The Gods of War, Is Religion the Primary Cause of Violent Conflict, in which we look at a number of discussions and how Christians have responded in the past. We take a look at Augustine's just war theory, which I don't think stands up very well, but there are big problems with it. But so if this is your thing and you want to look at that, then that might be a good place to start. But let's take a look at some of the rather horrible political leaders of the of the 20th century who were atheistic and whose atheism spelled out quite clearly that they did not value human life at all. So next slide. So here's Lenin. This talk of feeding the starving is nothing but an expression of the saccharine sweet sentimentality so characteristic of our intelligentsia. Right? In his view, people were simply nothing but animals. He thought that his big theory about how society should run was crucially important, but individual lives didn't matter at all. And one of his co-workers, let's move on a slide here, Leon Trotsky, it uses a very strange expression. I'll explain what he means by it in a minute. We must put an end once and for all to the papist Quaker babble about the sanctity of human life. Now, he himself, as you might know, is from a Jewish background, so he ought to subscribe to the idea of people being created in the image of God. But like Lenin, he's a hard-boiled atheist. Papist-Quaker. What? Catholics and Quakers, I mean, nowadays they've mostly learned to love one another, but they are pretty much at opposite ends of the Christian spectrum, right? But he didn't want to, he's clearly attacking what even the Orthodox Church would have taught in Russia, right? But he didn't want to do that because he was in Russia, right? But he knows that most Russians don't like the West. There's been this historical chasm. So he attacks the papacy, the Catholics over there, and Quaker. Well, there weren't many Quakers in Russia, but that was kind of shorthand for the various evangelical groups that had started in Russia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the early Baptists in Russia, and coming out of groups like the Molokans and Dukhobors and people like this. And the beginnings of the appearance of Pentecostalism. So it's kind of shorthand for that. And he's bracketing them together, which is absurd. But his central point is he's attacking the Christian and Jewish doctrine that people are valuable because created in the image of God. We need to get rid of this. Individual lives don't matter. And of course, the Bolsheviks went on to prove that by getting rid of millions of people that were inconvenient to them. Let's look at another pretty prominent atheist. So next slide. Mussolini. It matters little who wins. To make a people great, it's necessary to send them to battle, even if you have to kick them in the pants. That's what I shall do. And as we know, he did. It didn't work out very well for him, but he did that. I'll take another one of these kinds of leaders later in the century, Che Guevara. You know, you will probably already now have picked up the fact that I'm a cranky old man, but one of the many, many, many things I get cranky about is students and others thinking it is cool to wear the portrait of a mass murderer on their T-shirts. Would they do that for Hitler? I think not. So Che Guevara, I'm no Christ, nor a philanthropist. I'm the very opposite of Christ. I'll fight with all the arms within reach. Okay, so I'm giving you these examples just of where rejecting the sanctity of human life will take you. Whereas Christian stances, the Christians have varied and disagreed very much amongst themselves whether they should be pacifists, whether they should accept an Augustinian view or something else. But all of them, at least, have agreed that at least you should be extremely cautious about participating in combat at all, even if most of them have thought that there are circumstances that can justify it. Whereas these leaders are saying, well, never mind, all that matters is the political cause, and the individual human lives don't count at all. Now, when I was teaching in the seminary in London, so we were running a whole theology course. My subject, of course, was church history, and I was a specialist when I did my my postgrad studies, my master's and doctorate, in religious radicals in the Reformation era. But if you go to teach church history in a seminary, you don't have that luxury. If you are the church historian, you have to teach everything from the end of the book of Acts up until last Tuesday, right? The whole lot. And so you end up teaching across 2,000 years, and you learn a lot, because you better study hard if you're going to be able to teach. And the more I taught early church history, the more fascinated I became with it. And I also came to the conclusion that the strange characteristics of the early church, which outsiders noticed and often hated the Christians for, could all only be accounted for by the centrality of this teaching that people are created in the image of God. So let's have a look at the countercultural practices of early Christians. Next slide, please. People became Christians on an individual basis, not as households, unless all were converted. So that's why the New Testament talks about the possibility of Christian wives with unconverted husbands, Christian husbands with unconverted wives. That's in 1 Corinthians 7, 12 to 13, if you want to look it up. Slaves becoming Christians without their masters, in Titus 2:9 and 1 Peter 2:18. Masters becoming Christians without automatically including their slaves. That's what the Philemon on Onesimus story is all about. One of the conditions for becoming an elder was that your children were believers, and that means that there are parents becoming Christians without necessarily including their children. I mean, one of the ironies, particularly in the light of recent culture wars, is that the early Christians were accused of breaking up the solidarity of the family, because embracing a new religion was not something you did on your own. You did it as a job lot, but the Christians did. Even worse, they accepted slaves and ex-slaves without the permission of their masters, and even appointed them as leaders. Even worse, although slave marriages had no legal status in Roman law, the Christians respected them. Even worse, they recognized marriages between slave women and free men, and slave men and free women. Right? So imagine yourself back in apartheid era South Africa, where people can't marry across races. If the Christians there had said, well, never mind what the government says, we're doing this. Right? It's that kind of edgy. Right? People are becoming Christians on an individual basis. Why? Because they all matter to God, because they're created in the image of God. Basically, Roman society was fairly typical for pre-modern societies. Your status depended upon how wealthy you were, whether you were married, who you were married to, and how many children you had, because your duty in pre-modern society was to get married fairly early and then breed like rabbits because we need a big population because half of them are going to die before they grow up anyway, and we need a big population, so we've got a decent sized army to defend ourselves against the next country, right? That's absolutely standard in the pre-modern world. And what the Christians are saying is, well, actually, you don't even need to marry because you'll be more free to serve the Lord if you're single. That's a passage not often preached on in our churches, I find. Okay, so they have a generous attitude towards slaves. They reject abortion and infanticide. They accept the choice of a single life where that was done to concentrate on serving God. All of these things that only make sense if they come together, explained by the emphasis that the Christians have that you matter, whoever you are, because you're created in the image of a loving God. Okay, so I think we're about done here, and we're probably out of time and out of some people's patience, I think. Let's just finish off by reminding ourselves of the passage where we started. We'll just take a look at it again. And for brevity, I think we'll just read verses 3 to 5. Okay, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you've ordained, what is man that you're mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? For you've made him a little lower than the angels, and you've crowned him with glory and honor. Amen.